Hi, everybody. I hope you're all staying well. Um, I've been inspired, as I usually am when I'm doing my work as a family counselor and just counselor, somebody who's interested in psychology and kind of what's going on in the world. I know you are too. And so I noticed a little bit of a theme, I guess you could say, pop up. It's a very normal theme that I wanted to kind of speak on here, but it has to do with a theme or dynamic that appears oftentimes in family relationships. Family relationships are really, I was going to say, important right now, but also being tested. That there's nothing like family that tests us and tests our relationships. And so again, in many families that I work with, there's this dynamic I see mostly between parents, but Um, it can also exist between siblings. It can exist between a parent and a child. But this is a dynamic in which um parents are almost bipolar. In other words, they kind of set up opposite camps, like two different poles, setting up two different camps, like opposites. We often hear that opposites attract, right? But in this situation, it's almost very extreme opposites in terms of how parents parent, if you will, administer discipline or don't administer discipline. And you know how oftentimes it's like a bad cop, good cop situation. However, when the good cop, bad cop scenario is being played out in a crime show or whatever you might be watching, they're working together towards the same goal. Unfortunately, I guess you could say, is a lot of times in families and with parents, they're not working towards the same goals. And so you'll have one parent who seems to be like the drill sergeant, one parent who's watching everybody and making sure everybody does their chores and just holding everybody accountable, etc. And then you have the other parent here who seems to be very permissive, not necessarily holding people accountable, uh, lackadaisy around chores and commitments, things like this. And so, two very extremely different ways of parenting, if you will, or two different styles, two different ways of showing up. But of course, these parents are not happy with each other, right? They're all full of complaints. I talked to one parent and they say, well, she's too much of a drill sergeant. She's too critical. She's complaining all the time. And over here you have dad who, just kind of easy, happy-go-lucky. It kind of, you almost see it like, one parent does all the disciplinary stuff, the other parent does very little. you know One parent, really is very quick to set boundaries and to maintain those boundaries, and all is about consequences and boundaries. And the other parent is, some parent would people would say, kind of a little bit of a limp noodle. Not really willing to set a boundary, and is certainly not willing to maintain a boundary. And when I speak to these parents separately, they'll often say, well, the reason I am the way that I am, the reason I parent this way, is because of the other parent. The other parent just goes way too far, way too overboard, and so I have to compensate. I have to compensate for the other person. I wouldn't have to do this, they would say, if the other parent would just step up, or if the other parent would just relax, or what it is. It's like, because of this other parent, I have to act this way. I have to compensate. But you see, what's interesting is that they're compensating for one another, but they're not happy about it. It leading to resentment. They're complaining about each other. They're bickering with each other. They're super unhappy with the results they're getting as parents. Uh, and the children are confused. The children are in this dynamic, and they kind of know, hey, if you want something, go ask dad or go ask mom, whoever the permissive one is. If you want somebody to enforce the rules, go talk to this person, go talk to this parent. And so kids kind of learn that there's a division between the parents and they know how to play each parent, right? But it's also a very miserable place to be in. It's a miserable thing to witness. So you have two parents who feel like they're compensating for one another. The word compensate is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's pretty much the same word as compensation. What's compensation? Well, think about it, from your perspective. When you go to work and you sacrifice all these hours and, this time and everything that you have, your energy, your passion, you want something back, right? Compensation. We want to be compensated. We want to receive acknowledgement. We want to receive a reward. We want to receive something for our efforts. However, when you listen to these parents, they're miserable. They're resentful. They don't think they're getting anything back for all their efforts. In fact, they're super exhausted. And the tension and the conflict, escalates. Now, as I mentioned before, opposites attract, that's for sure. I've often said is that, that's either a really cruel trick or there's some sort of a blessing in it. I mean, if you had two people that were exactly the same, I suppose, I don't know if they could even get along. I mean, but there would be a lot in common. They would do a lot of things together, but they would almost kind of like be a bit crippled because they couldn't cover much ground. If two people have the same skill set, you might be able to do pretty good at a few things, but you wouldn't really be able to do really good at a number of things. And it takes quite a big skill set to manage a household or a business or a family. And so one could say that if two people who are opposites, who have very different skill sets, could come together and work together, well then, wow, they would be a force to reckon with, wouldn't they? They would be able to cover a lot more ground, get way more done, generate better ideas, be more flexible in terms of what their kids need. With one parent, you're more like one child than the other, and it's difficult for you to relate to the other child because your style isn't like their style. And so if you had another parent in your life, well, maybe that opposite might be exactly what's needed in this situation. But here's the deal, isn't it? I mean, if opposites attract and they do everything differently, or most things differently, then there's also the high probability that they'll kind of rub each other the wrong way. That they'll kind of, they'll anger each other, they'll frustrate each other. So what's the remedy to that? Well, the remedy to that really starts with a conviction or a value that an individual must hold in their character. They must embrace and bring that to the relationship. It can be developed within the relationship, but what I see a lot of times is that by this time the people are so embroiled in the tension and the conflict and the acrimony of that relationship that it's then often difficult to pull back and foster what's necessary. What's necessary? You've heard me say this before. The one conviction that levels the playing field that is absolutely necessary to create harmony is humility. If a person is an individual, is a humble person, what does that mean? It means that they don't, that they're not arrogant, that they're not narcissistic. They know that they have some skills and abilities, but they also know that there's limitations to themselves. They see their own blind spots. They keep themselves deflated. They don't let their head get too big. Now, people like to think that they practice humility, but really it's quite rare. People will often say, I know I'm not perfect. In fact, when I counsel parents who are stuck in this dynamic of compensating for one another and being super resentful and being ineffective as parents, they'll often say, "Oh yeah, I know I'm not a perfect parent." But it almost feels like those words are just sitting right there in their mouth. In other words, it's about as shallow as you can possibly get. It's like a cliche that people use to maybe try to satisfy some level of conscience within themselves that they should be humble, but they're not really being humble. Humility is something that you have in your heart, that you carry with you. See, when you have two opposites, this is kind of what's called a catalyst, or in alchemy, it's an alchemical catalyst. In other words, you have two opposites, and you need to bring them together to create something bigger, to create something more powerful, to create something better, but they're opposites. So there's naturally tension between them. So you need a third element. You need to bring in a third element in order to harmonize the two. Humility will do that. What happens when a person has humility in their heart and they bring humility to a relationship and those two people are opposites? They no longer want compensation. They're no longer compensating for one another. See, in compensation, you imagine you go to work, right? And you work because you have an occupation. So you're going to occupy a particular role. You're going to provide a particular skill, or provide a particular product or whatever. In other words, you're filling a void. You're filling a void. And that's what you're getting paid for. That's compensation. That's what's wrong, if you will, about this when it shows up in relationship. Because if a spouse or your spouse or you're looking at your spouse or your child, or the child is looking at you, and all they see are deficits. Remember what I was saying. Each parent has the same story. They would say, I wouldn't be compensating if she would only step up, if he would only show up differently. And so each person is seeing the other person as lacking or having deficits that they need to fill. Right? And they also resent doing it. See, in humility, we give ourselves and our skills and abilities to our relationships and our families, not because we see a deficit, but because we love them. And when we love them, we're willing to make a contribution. We're willing to share our abilities and skills with the family. And because it's a loving gesture, we don't need compensation. The act of giving, the act of making that sacrifice and giving and making a contribution is sufficient. That's a life-giving source. That's a life-giving experience. So what you see there, folks, is people who are involved in this kind of compensation, gimme, right? Seeing lack, seeing the negative. What they need to embrace is the humility, which transforms the need for compensation into the desire to contribute. What we might call complement each other. So when opposites come together, instead of being in tension and conflict, the humility creates a complement, if you will, a marriage. They fuse together and become harmonious. They work together. See, when there's compensation going on, these parents aren't working together. They're working alone. They're working against one another. There's constant tension because there's constant belief that there's a lack and deficit. This is not a love story. This is not a love story. So, parents, being able to come together with your partner, with your spouse in humility and complimenting one another Becoming bigger than what you could be by yourself is what your kids love to see. But the cornerstone to this is going to be humility. Okay? Again, I'm doing this video because I see this a ton in the families that I'm working with and in the parents who are squabbling, compensating for one another. And there's no love, there's no affection. You know, everybody's walking on eggshells in the home. There's no happiness. So how do you get through this again? Be personally accountable. Examine yourself. Be mindful. Ask yourself, do I hold resentments against my partner? What accusations do I have against them? Am I coming from a place where I think that they have a deficit or they lack something? And do I resent them because of that? And now I have to make a contribution here. I have to kind of step up and go overboard. You see, when parents are compensating, they do go overboard. They do. The permissive parent is going to go too far. They're going to be a sucker, if you will, for buying their kids gifts and whatever they want. They will spoil their children. The overly demanding and rigid parent will kind of just be seen as a taskmaster, will be disliked in the home. There's a price to pay for both. Talk to the one who is spoiled their children, and eventually they will come to say, I feel guilty. I know that I've spoiled my children, and I feel guilty. The other parent will say, I know I've been hard on my kids, and I feel guilty. You see, guilt is the common denominator. Right? And that's how do you get out of guilt? You start to see your partner as innocent. As I said before, in compensation, I have to judge my partner, my wife, my son. I have to judge them critically. I have to judge them as lacking. I have to judge them as having deficits. I have to judge them as maybe being lazy or unmotivated or whatever it is, but I have a set of negative accusations against the very people that I say that I love. That would be plenty of reason to generate guilt on my part. So being able to take inventory and being personally accountable for having done this is the way through, and that's the way to generate humility as well. It's not about getting over it, it's about getting through it. And you get through it through personal accountability. So I'll leave it there right now. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening.